Moving on to the next session, management of sugar-coated disease, acute coronary syndrome in type 2 diabetes mellitus. I request Speaker Dr. Soumik Choudhury, Consultant Interventional Cardiologist, Peerless Hospital, Kolkata, to come up on the stage. I request Chairpersons Dr. Sadaj Soni and Dr. Mohesh Kumar Choudhury to come up on the stage as chairpersons.
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Hello. Good evening. This is the last session of the meeting, and this is a really one important topic. One more session. Okay. Penultimate session. Management of sugar-coated disease, ACS in type 2 diabetes. To deliberate this session, we have the Soumik Choudhury, which will deliberate the ACS in diabetes. We know the ACS is very rewarding if managed and diagnosed in timely fashion. And in diabetes, the diagnosis may be difficult because of atypical presentation. I am not wasting time. Dr. Soumik Choudhury to deliberate this session.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. I was actually thinking, sir, I was the last session, so I thought I would be like number 11 batsman coming into bat, but evidently I'm number 10 today and not number 11. Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Soumik Choudhury. I'm working as a consultant interventional cardiologist and the clinical lead of the Department of Cardiology in Peerless, Kolkata. And today what we'll be discussing is, I think, something that we see every day. Literally, I literally see it every day, I would say. And it's something that's very, very dangerous, not simply because of that moment. Obviously, an acute coronary syndrome at its moment of presentation to us is obviously extremely crucial, extremely difficult sometimes to manage, but it's not just that moment alone, but what we do at that moment, and beyond that, how do we improve the morbidity, the mortality, the cardiovascular outcomes, the ejection fraction. All of that is actually very contingent on how we handle that event at the time. And especially when it's beautifully sugar-coated for us, in the garb of diabetes mellitus, things really start becoming a bit difficult. So, as I look at diabetes, in fact, the first two questions that I always ask my patients when I'm trying to assess the cardiovascular status of a patient, regardless of whether it's chronic stable angina or acute coronary syndrome, once, always, are you diabetic? Have you been diagnosed with diabetes? And it's very important these days to ask, have you ever been diagnosed with diabetes? Because very often I hear, yeah, I had diabetes 4 years ago and then I cured it, now I'm fine. Which in other words means I stopped taking the medications and I have a 350 blood sugar right now. So it's very important to ask, because past history of diabetes is actually a thing, which is, according to patients, not a present history. Nevertheless, each 1% elevation in HbA1c significantly increases the cardiovascular risk. In fact, more than 50% of ACS events can be directly associated with a hyperglycemic state, which might be an overt diabetes or even might be a pre-diabetes at the stage. So if I look at outcomes of diabetics with ACS and non-diabetics with ACS, ACS by itself is significantly having a high mortality outcome. However, if you have a diabetes along with that, everything increases. Whether you look at MACE, all-cause death, heart failure, all of them are significantly worse. So what are my priorities when I'm treating my patient? Obviously, my first priority is I'm going to treat the ACS without a doubt. Everything else is later. Right now, I'm going to treat the ACS first. Once I've done that, then I have to reduce. Obviously, I'm trying to reduce the diabetic status and improve it. I'm going to prevent recurrent coronary events. I'm going to prevent heart failure development. And I'm going to try to improve the cardiac remodeling. The negative remodeling I'm going to improve towards a positive outcome. Just the first part might be very important at the day, but everything becomes important for the overall prognosis of the patient. So if I look at what is my ACS prime event management, Obviously, if I can revascularize, I will revascularize. But where is my medical therapy that comes in? And these days, without a doubt, a class 1 indication is ticagrelor. Now, why do I say that? Because initially when ticagrelor first came as a dynamic antithrombotic, a P2Y12 inhibitor, it had some amazing plus points. Obviously, it was not a prodrug, it was a directly acting drug. It had a very, very fast onset of action. Meaning you could load the patient and start your procedure within 5-10 minutes. With a clopidogrel, we always knew that reaching that peak half-life would be about 2 hours. So effectively, we would start the procedure knowing that my peak of my antithrombotic effect would come maybe after the procedure ends. But with ticagrelor, that doesn't happen. However, there was a risk, or I would say there was a worry, that this would have much higher bleeding risks. So there was this consensus, initially I would say, that in interventional procedures, if we are planning, then let's go with ticagrelor. If we are not planning interventional, if there is only medical therapy, then probably go for clopidogrel as the P2Y12. That was the initial point we all had. However, that has been debunked. There is no significant major bleeding increase with ticagrelor regardless of our treatment strategy. So as per the current guidelines, and this is 2023 ESC, I was actually thankful. I was there when these guidelines were there. I was there in that hall. They were very clear that regardless of your treatment modality, whether it is operative or interventional, or whether it is medical, ticagrelor is a class 1 indicator of choice for P2 as a P2Y12 inhibitor. So there is no real justification these days of clopidogrel loading the patient and going for a procedure. What if, and this is a very common, I would say, condition, what if a patient is diagnosed as an ACS, say in the periphery? Patient is loaded with a clopidogrel and an aspirin, reaches the center maybe 2 hours later or 1.5 hours later, then what? Say I'm going to do a procedure, what do I do? Even there the guidelines say you can safely reload ticagrelor in these patients. So whether your patient is clopidogrel naive or whether your patient is clopidogrel loaded, ticagrelor can be reloaded in such way, and we routinely do that. And to be very frank, we've not had any significantly higher major bleeds ourselves as well, and the guideline data also bears that out. The other very important point, and this is something that has now gone even further in the context, is the rapid reduction of the LDL levels. Now this is very important. Earlier we used to say, go, take your time, bring it down. Everybody knows the numbers, 40, 55, 70, 90. We know that in our sleep, the LDL levels that we must reach. But the time frame was a bit gray. In 1 month, in 2 months, in 3 months, in 6 months, there was really no specific time frame in which you had to reach your limit. These days, this is 2024 and 2025 AHA data, reaching the targets as early as possible is important. So this target, which is LDL-C level of less than 55 and a 50% reduction from baseline, both are important. If somebody had an MI at an LDL of 70, then I want to bring them down to 35. My 55 is not enough. I want a 50% reduction over and above reaching the target of 55. Hence, this within 6 weeks is now the sine qua non. So high intensity statins right at the beginning, probably going with a lot of people these days believe, and even I am doing the same, high intensity statin plus an ezetimibe right up front. You do not wait for the LDL levels to be seen at 6 weeks or 3 months and then add on a second therapy. Go with 2 therapies right at the beginning. We are comfortable using 2 antihypertensives. We are comfortable using 2 OHs. Why are we not comfortable using 2 LLTs, lipid-lowering therapies? It makes sense. Why do we wait? Why do we wait for another event to take place? Why do we wait for... Because this whole lipid time is also important. Like we say, the diabetic time, how long the patient is at diabetes, even how long the patient is exposed to hyperlipidemia is as important as reaching those target levels. Now, if I look at the data, we know this, the Plato trial, we all have heard about it. It was a game-changing trial, significant reduction in CV death, MIs, and all-cause deaths. And if you looked at this point, this is very, very important. Dual antiplatelet therapy, initially we all agreed the 1 year part, then what? There's very good data that in patients who are having a low bleeding risk and at least 2 or more risk factors in which diabetes is one of the prime risk factors we look at, you can safely continue ticagrelor 60 BD, not 90, 60 BD for at least up to 3 years more. And I can confidently say my younger patients are very well on this regimen. Most of them are 2 or 3 years down the line from their ACS, still on DAPTs and doing well. There is no increased bleeding risk, there is no increased major bleeds, and they generally have a much better thrombotic outcomes. So using the original ticagrelor, now that makes sense, much lower risk of stent thrombosis. Actually, it's safer for the patient and I would say also safer for the doctor to use the original molecule because it makes sure that you have guideline based and you can justify using what you're using. Now, once we have done the primary ACS part, used the high dose of statins, used the ticagrelor, we have done the first part. Then, and as I said, we have the data, rosuvastatin, significant reductions in the Jupiter trial again. Even if you forget the Jupiter, the Saturn, there's a number of beautiful galactic data, I would say probably for them. All of them have shown significant risk reductions when high dose intensity statins are used. But what's next? Because we are talking about the diabetic patient, so what's next? What's next is very important is the fact that a lot of patients will get diagnosed for the first time as diabetics when they have the ACS. They probably never had a diagnosis, they never had a HbA1c or a fasting sugar seen before that. There are far too many 35-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 45-year-olds who are landing up with MIs. They probably never had a blood sugar check before that. Even on the other hand, a lot of times we have seen patients have had a diagnosis of diabetes and very soon within that, maybe 2 months, 3 months, 6 months down the line, they're having their first ACS. So probably they have been diabetic for quite some time, just got diagnosed, and that long period of hyperglycemia that was existing, worsening the polyvascular atherosclerotic phase that we have, that was triggering the acute coronary syndrome. So where do we go with such type of patients? Metformin we know has been a workhorse for a long, long time. But what if you had a drug which decreased your diabetic status, improved your HbA1c, as well as showed fantastic CV outcome data, improving cardiovascular outcomes, improving heart failure hospitalizations, improving 3-point MACE, improving CV deaths. That are the SGLT2s, that is dapagliflozin. So you are actually adding on beyond the hyperglycemia management. I mean, I have an OHA, oral hypoglycemic agent, that's an SGLT2 without a doubt. But am I using it purely as an OHA here? I'm not. I am using it for my CV outcome. I'm using it for my heart failure hospitalization improvements. I'm using it for my CV death outcomes. I'm using it for preventing events. In fact, there's even data which shows there's a stabilization of arrhythmias. Ventricular tachyarrhythmias are improved. Beta blockers have always been the gods for tachyarrhythmia improvement. That is why they are one of the guideline-directed therapies for HFrEF. But even SGLT2s have shown similar, I would not say probably not to that exalted levels of beta blockers in terms of this arrhythmias, but definitely similar outcomes. So if you look at this HbA1c reduction, it's sustained. It's sustained with dapagliflozin as compared to sulfonylureas. And even if you look at the AD, and I will make it bigger, with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which means there is a definite event that has taken place, or with high indicators of cardiovascular disease, either one of them, you can go with an SGLT2 or a GLP-1 receptor agonist. I am not going to be negative about GLP-1. They are also excellent drugs which work both ways. But SGLT2s have one slight edge above it. Even with a non-diabetic, today as per guidelines, you can give an SGLT2. If it's a diabetic, it's very easy. You catch your ear with this side. Diabetic patient, I'll give it for the diabetic status, along with the heart failure hospitalization, every improvement that I get. For the non-diabetic patient, I will go round. I will use it for the heart failure improvement, the HFrEF data, and I can use that here also for the improvement of the outcome in heart failure hospitalizations. So both ways I can do that with an SGLT2s. Unfortunately, at this moment, I cannot do that with a GLP-1 receptor agonist. That is where SGLT2s have the slight edge. Now, intensive management of glucose alone, the question that arises is why SGLT2s are not the strongest and oral hypoglycemic agents. We know that. In fact, that is one of the good things about it. They rarely, if ever, cause hypoglycemia. But pure intensive using high dose sulfonylureas and metformin, would that be enough to improve cardiovascular outcomes? No. There's enough data that shows that pure intensive glucose management alone does not prevent the ACS. It's having drugs which have glucose management along with other outcome data or other outcome improvements, that's what improves the ACS or the ACS outcomes, I would say. So preventing this recurrent MIs, preventing the recurrent coronary events, in diabetics with prior MI versus diabetics with no prior MI, DAPA data again, 21% further reduction of MIs, MACE, and if initiated within, and this is the best period for it, up to 2 years, significant data that we had. That is the best time to start it. This is not the outcome data for 2 years post the MI. It's starting the DAPA. So even if the patient had an MI, say 6 months back or 8 months back, you're still justified in starting the SGLT2. It's not that it has to be only on the next day or within the week. You can start it even 1 year later and still have outcome results which are good. Now, revascularization, this ACS, what I really want to show you are the data that's famous, the DELIVER data, the DELIVER TIMI58, the DAPA HF, I'll finish in a minute, DAPA HF data, the data from the DAPA CKD data, even the kidney data that we have, all of them have shown significant reductions in cardiovascular deaths, reductions in 3-point MACE, but the best outcome data, the driving force behind the SGLT2 outcomes have been heart failure hospitalizations. They have dramatically improved. They have kept people out of hospitals. They have kept people at home longer, and they have kept people better. So that's one of the real tangible benefits that we've had when SGLT2s have been added early. And how early can you start? Right in the hospital. We start SGLT2s routinely post-MI in all our patients unless absolutely contraindicated. And the only absolute contraindication I really do have is an active UTI or active genital tract infection. If there is one like that, I will wait. Otherwise, an SGLT2 starts right at top. So the results, fantastic. Most patients are doing well. And the final data that I wanted to show was a study called, where's my DAPA MODA? Yes. The DAPA MODA data, that's the remodeling data. Even if your patient has gone into a chronic heart failure, you would assume that these patients are already too fibrosed. They are not going to have any EF outcomes. They are not going to have improvements in their EFs or in their LA volume index or in their LV cavity dilation. We earlier assumed they were too far gone. However, even in these patients, if you look at the LA volume index or the LV index or the NT-proBNP levels, even in these patients, adding DAPA has shown improvement. That's the DAPA MODA trial, and that's really a very, very refreshing thought. So, to conclude, I will just look at this, the ventricular arrhythmias looked at. If your patient is OAD naive, adding a DAPA right at top makes sense. Even if your patient is a controlled diabetic, purely and purely for heart failure hospitalization improvements or your CV outcome improvement, please add an SGLT2 like dapagliflozin over and above whatever is your standard of therapy. Thank you.
Thank you for the nice presentation. Which day you will start the dapagliflozin in post-ACS patients?
In the post-ACS patients, ma'am, usually on the day of the ACS we do not start because that day the hemodynamics are a bit unsteady. But within 24 to 48 hours and definitely pre-discharge, unless, ma'am, but what we have done, because we've had a couple of GTIs and UTIs we always rule that out. We will send an urine RE on the day of the ACS as well, rule out an active urinary infection. If there is none, then before discharge, definitely by day 2, we start the dapagliflozin.
Yeah, before discharge we can start.
Absolutely, in admission. Yes, it should be in hospital.
Diabetes is very notorious that it is changes the whole milieu. It decreases the fibrinolysis effect, it decreases and it causes multiple only single vessel we don't get, multi-vessel disease we get, and moreover their outcomes are also very bad. So we have to be very active and even fibrinolytic results are also
Absolutely, ma'am. Not the best. Not the
because
best.
diabetes, it is changing the whole milieu. The cardiac muscles, they were not using the FFA, unable to use because insulin resistance is there. There are endothelin increased and the vasodilators, they are not effective. So diabetes with ACS, it is not 1 + 1 = 2, but rather it is very ominous thing.
It is, ma'am.
Thank you for nice presentation.
Thank you.
In your clinical practice,
Yes, sir.
do you use evolocumab along with statin and ezetimibe in ACS patient?
Sir, I couldn't hear. So, would you use which one, sir?
Evolocumab along with statin
yeah,
and
with,
ezetimibe.
PCSK9 inhibitors. Yes, sir.
For rapid reduction of LDL.
To be very honest, sir, not as often as I would want to. If I want to look at the data and if I want to look at the guidelines, I would definitely want to use it more. But financial factor does become a limiting event, sir, with either PCSK9s or even if I go one step ahead and I say inclisiran. Even inclisiran has now got ACS data. But a few patients we have used and few patients we have actually used a bit later, sir. What we have done is we have looked at the REB regimen. We looked at rosuvastatin, ezetimibe and bempedoic acid. Even with the maximal tolerated, and I will say tolerated because a lot of patients don't tolerate the maximal dose of all three. So I have to keep statins at a somewhat maybe 20, a rosuvastatin. Even then when they do not reach their target levels or are hovering, like if I'm looking at a target of 55 and they hover even at 2, 3, 4 months, they're hovering at 100, 1, 4. When they promise that they're compliant to the medication, that is the time when I'm really adding PCSK9s. But to be very honest, I'm not adding them upfront, but probably we should be adding them more upfront, sir.
And regarding heart failure with preserved ejection
Yes, sir.
fraction, along with the SGLT2 inhibitor and finerenone, do you use GLP-1 analog?
Yes, sir. But only in diabetics, unfortunately.
diabetics.
Yes, sir. Because even today we don't have a non-diabetic guideline for them, sir.
Diabetic with obesity without diabetes, it is indicated.
Yes, obesity without diabetes, but with heart failure, sir.
With the heart failure or with the high cardiovascular risk?
Yes, obesity without, if I want to purely use it for obesity, sir, I can use it. I do have the recommendations. If there's a BMI more than 27, then even if the patient is non-diabetic, I theoretically have a recommendation for using it, sir. If the patient is diabetic, then I don't even need that higher BMI. Even a BMI, I think 25 plus with a type 2 diabetes is a justification for using a GLP-1 receptor agonist. But without diabetes, as an obesity drug, yes. Without diabetes, on heart failure and obesity, I do not think, sir, the guidelines have clearly put that. It's a data-free zone at this moment. But probably I will use it from the obesity perspective, and that should improve the HFpEF outcome.
In patient with CT coronary angiography, patient is totally asymptomatic.
Yes, sir.
But there is 30-40% lesion is there.
Yes, sir.
So lifestyle modification, statin and everything. How long you will give antiplatelet agent in such patient who is totally asymptomatic?
Sir,
and 30-40% lesion is there.
Yeah, I would also look at the calcium score along with that, sir. Because just the plaques may not be important. There are patients who have 30-40% plaques might have a calcium score of more than 100. So if the calcium score is also higher range, at least more than 100 or close to it, I would probably use a single antiplatelet for a prolonged indefinite period, provided there is no major bleed. However, in this point, what I want to say one thing, there is no justification for using dual antiplatelets in a chronic coronary syndrome. This is something that I think is abused. Far too often we give patients dual, meaning there are patients who bleed. This type of patients, sir, when we are doing the risk benefit, obviously the bleeding risk is what we are worried about. Giving dual antiplatelets to this patient would be wrong. But that's what happens a lot, unfortunately.
But,
Single antiplatelet, yes, sir, I would.
But regarding calcium score, patient may have soft plaque, advanced lesion, even with calcium score 0.
Yes, sir, they could, both ways could happen, sir. They could not have very high lesions but have a high calcium score, or have a very low calcium score with 50% or 60% because they are non-calcified plaques. They are soft plaques, basically.
Soft plaque.
I would use an antiplatelet in these patients, but a single antiplatelet, not dual, ever, unless there's an ACS.
Thank you.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Sir, about dapagliflozin you have
Yes,
told.
sir.
I am asking that whether empagliflozin has got little age over dapagliflozin or it is same?
Actually, sir, there have been no head-on trials, and there shouldn't be either, because in every head-on trial, somebody wins and somebody loses. And these are two drugs which are really good drugs. To be very honest, it's really, at least in SGLT2s, I would say, not purely a class effect, but not purely not a class effect either. Why do I say that? All SGLT2s are not same. If you look at, say, CANA or ER2, they have not really reached the same levels as DAPA or EMPA. But DAPA and EMPA are like those two runners who are far ahead of the rest. Between them, if you ask me to be very cutthroat, in some places, EMPA has shown a little better outcomes. That's predominantly the EMPA-REG outcome data of the cardiovascular 32% relative risk reduction. But if you look at the DELIVER-TIMI data and the DAPA-HF data, especially in the non-diabetics, DAPA in pure heart failure actually has an edge over EMPA. But again, it's not a head-to-head, sir. They had separate study groups. But
Actually,
if I look at
EMPA
ASCVD to be only from the EMPA-REG outcome, because why do I say that's a bit of a pinch of salt? Because that EMPA-REG outcome data was only diabetics. They did not look at non-diabetics in EMPA-REG outcome. Once diabetics and non-diabetics both come in the discussion, then they're probably similar, but if there is a heart failure associated with it, then DAPA has a very slight edge over EMPA. But does that mean we cannot give EMPA in these patients? We can very well give EMPA in these patients also. One SGLT2 must be there. No justification to not give it.
EMPA has got a
And
little
sir,
edge
another
over-
one question, sir,
Yes, sir.
that regarding the antiplatelet,
Yes, sir.
we continue it after 70 or like
Again,
that.
sir, I
age.
look at the bleeding risk, sir, to be very honest. If they are low, because even if you look at the Themis data that we had for 1+3, of ticagrelor, which is a lower dose of ticagrelor, even there they said only in low bleeding risk patients. So if you think your patient has a high bleeding risk, then probably do not extend it indefinitely. After 1 year, individualize for each patient. If you believe the patient is not having significant bleeding risk, go ahead. But if more than 70, 75, risk of falls, risk of bleeds, I would probably use 1 year of DAPT full dose, maybe 6 months to a year of the 60 mg dose, and then I would taper it out. But up to 4 years, we have data we can give. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We conclude the session.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much.
I request Dr. Shudil Lila to felicitate Dr. Shomik Chaudhuri, Dr. Mahesh Kumar Chaudhuri, and Dr. Sharad Sani. Now there will be another session which is supposed to be in the hall B, but it will happen in hall A. Iglarixing, a solid approach for comprehensive type 2 diabetes mellitus management. I request Chairperson Dr. M.L. Vansali and Dr. Pawan Agarwal to come on the stage. I request Speaker Dr. Debmalyo Sanyal to come up on the stage.
I'm Dr. Debmalyo Sanyal. He is a professor at KPC Medical College, and he is well-known figure in endocrinology in Calcutta, so he does not require any further introduction. So today's topic is Iglar-Lixi, that is GLP-1 analog along with basal insulin. So Dr. Sanyal, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. So today I will be the last batsman. I don't think the slides are moving. Yeah, fine. Thank you. So this was the landmark study. I think this is also similar with the ICMR data showing about 60 to 70% of our diabetes patients are not achieving their HbA1c targets. Again, 66% are obese. If you take central obesity, it's about 80 to 90% of our diabetes subjects are obese. You do a waist circumference, 90 centimeter in men and 80 centimeter in women, you have central obesity. So almost 90% of diabetes subjects are obese. And if you see, more than 20%, about 40% would be having complications. Actually, it was seen in another study, about 60% had already developed cardiovascular disease or high risk factors at presentation. Again, on insulin, less than 20% of the subjects are on insulin. So, what are the insulin options we have? One is the basal insulin, which is now standard of care by most of the guidelines. But most guidelines suggest you first go for the GLP-1, then you go for a basal insulin. There are some which suggest you can up-titrate with a basal plus, that is 1 dose of bolus plus basal, or basal bolus 3 times. Or you can shift to a premixed insulin, which is very commonly used in our country, twice daily premixed insulin. The other option, which is fast picking up, is a basal insulin plus GLP-1. You can have even the weekly GLP-1s, the daily GLP-1s, which are cheaper now. Then you have the very good option of a combination of basal insulin and a GLP-1 in a single shot. And as we know, we have what is called trypanophobia, that is a fear of needles. So most of our patients don't want to take a shot, and taking 2 shots is even more challenging. So once we need to up-titrate from a basal insulin, we have the option of basal plus, basal bolus, or a premixed. Now, all of these 3 therapies would require intense monitoring, more number of injections, more hypoglycemia, and also intuitively more weight gain. So these are all the problems which are enhanced by increasing the number of pricks. Whatever regime you choose, basal plus, basal bolus, or a premixed, and hypoglycemia increase. And the dose of insulin will increase, which will further lead to an additional gain in body weight. Whereas a combination of a basal insulin with a GLP, whether used separately or used together, especially if it is used together, the pricks also come down. The dose of insulin requirement is less, hypoglycemia is less, weight gain is less, and also the compliance improves significantly, and the insulin dose comes down significantly as well. So you can address multiple pathophysiological defects with complementary mechanism of action. The basal insulin takes care of fasting, the GLP-1 takes care of postprandial, the weight with increase with insulin is neutralized by the GLP-1, the hypoglycemia is decreased, the insulin dose is decreased. And there is better convenience, better adherence because of one single shot, and greater persistence with therapy, and reduce side effects of weight gain as well as hypoglycemia. So, if you look at pathophysiological defects, with insulin you are targeting the fasting glucose, the gluconeogenesis, whereas with the GLP-1, because of decrease in glucagon secretion, decreased gastric emptying, you decrease the postprandial spike. So you are controlling the postprandial glucose. So you are targeting the main pathophysiological defects with insulin, like gluconeogenesis from the liver, the glucose uptake in the muscles, the lipolysis. Whereas with the GLP-1, you are tackling satiety, the gastric emptying, the glucagon increase, as well as increase the insulin secretion. If you look at the current ADA guidelines, it suggests that a combination of GLP and basal insulin can be very useful with regards to intensification. And the AAC also suggests that this combination is better than what is commonly prescribed premixed insulin because of lower hypoglycemia, lower weight gain, and better flexibility. With premixed insulin, it is more rigid, less flexible. And the ADA also suggests that the weight gain and hypoglycemia is lower. So there are several trials with Iglar Lixi, which is now the only available combination of glargine with lixisenatide. We will be looking into the two studies, the most relevant study. One is with degludec and aspart, which is a combination of long-acting insulin with aspart once daily, comparing with Iglar Lixi in a 45-year-old diabetes for 7 to 8 years, and once daily, both being used once daily. That is a combination of basal and a bolus versus a combination of a basal insulin glargine with lixisenatide. Similar A1C of 8.5, you see a much better HbA1c lowering, more significant A1C lowering. Again, you can see a significant decrease in body weight, whereas with the IDEG as there was an increase in body weight. The insulin dose requirement again is significantly lower with the Lixi-LAN combination. So you see the percentage of subjects achieving the target without weight gain, without hypoglycemia is almost double compared to those who are only on insulin. So we have less weight gain, less hypoglycemia, almost 50% more achieving the target. So weight gain is much less, so is the hypoglycemia episodes. And number of patients achieving target is also higher, 70%. And very importantly, lower incidences of hypoglycemia, especially lower incidence of nocturnal hypoglycemia is something which is generally reassuring. So better A1C control, lower body weight, and lower risk of hypoglycemia. So, and lower doses of insulin required as well. Again, the other very important trial is whether this combination is as good as a premix twice daily, because that is combination which is most commonly used by most of us. And here the patient is already on a basal insulin when it has failed to control the A1C. So when either Iglar Lixi is used once daily compared to a Biasp 30 used twice daily, again you see the A1C lowering is better. The weight, there is a 1 kg almost body weight reduction compared to a more than 1 kg body weight gain. And again you can see more than double, here almost triple the number of subjects achieving the target without weight gain, without hypoglycemia. So almost triple the number of targets achieving the target without any hypoglycemic episodes or weight gain. So a significant improvement. And again the total insulin dose is more than half. So, with regards to the combination of premixed insulin. So almost half the dose insulin which is required. Again you see hypoglycemia at all times. Whether any hypoglycemia, level 1 is as we all know, less than 70. Level 2 is clinically significant, that is less than 54, reduced by about 50%. Again, nocturnal hypoglycemia, whether you take it between 12 a.m. and 6 a.m. or after sleep, both are reduced by 66%. So significant lower risk of hypoglycemia, including the most dreaded, that is nocturnal hypoglycemia, fewer injections, better glycemic control, less weight gain, and simple and well tolerated. So how do we titrate? Generally, what happens is we have a combination of 2 units of insulin and 1 microgram of lixisenatide. So we start with a 10 unit, especially in patients who are already on a basal insulin of 20 units. We start with 10 units because already the lixisenatide is also on board, and increase gradually, up titrate. Whereas if the initial insulin, the patient was previously on more than 20 units of basal insulin, we start with a 20 units standard dose and gradually up titrate. Again, it has to be given subcutaneously 1 hour prior to meal. We generally give it in the morning before breakfast. It covers almost all the meals, especially breakfast and lunch. Again, if a person misses the meal, one can take it for the next meal, but ideally one shouldn't be taking it that way. Every time with the same meal is ideal. Again, in special population, no contraindication in elderly, can be used in mild and moderate renal impairment, not in severe renal impairment, GFR below 30. Again, mild and moderate hepatic impairment. Pregnancy and lactation, obviously, GLP-1 is not yet approved. So in summary, a combination, a synergistic combination, controlling both fasting and PP with a single shot, and effective A1C reduction, fasting PP reduction, multiple pathophysiological defects with once daily dosing, weight benefits, actually weight lowering even starting with insulin, lower risk of hypoglycemia, and better GI tolerance because you are increasing slowly, is you are getting to target with one shot with lower hypoglycemia and lower weight gain, and cardiovascular safety as well. So one injection once a day, 1 hour prior to meal, taking care of your HbA1c. So the trials showed that the premixed insulin compared to that, this Igla Lixi had better glucose control and lower hypoglycemia and weight gain. And even with when it was compared to IDEG ASP once daily, it had a better A1C control, lower hypoglycemia, and lesser weight gain, rather a weight loss. So this is a very important treatment option in suboptimally controlled patients, especially on basal insulin or multiple oral hypoglycemic agents when they are failed on multiple oral hypoglycemic agents, especially our population where the postprandial spike is significant with a lower risk of hypoglycemia and minimal weight gain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Devamalya Sanyal. Seeing all these benefits without hypoglycemia, without weight gain, would you prefer it as a first injectable therapy in type 2 diabetes who are OHA failure?
So if we see it for a lot of our patients who have the issue of postprandial hyperglycemia, because unlike in the West, our population has both fasting and postprandial hyperglycemia as an important component. So there, this remains a very good option compared to a premixed insulin, because as we have shown also, you require twice daily dosing, the risk of hypoglycemia is very high, the flexibility is less, same time, same food has to be taken. So that is again very important. So that flexibility out here is more. The weight gain is not there, there is some amount of weight loss, and hypoglycemia, whenever you have a bolus component, mind you, whether it is a bolus you are giving with a basal plus or with a premixed, the hypoglycemia increases. So this is a very important option even as a first line therapy in our population as well, because we are using premixed insulin as first line therapy in our lot of our patients.
Mixed is not physiological. We cannot adjust the dose.
Yes, that's important. But again, sir, with regards to a basal plus, when we are intensifying, or a basal bolus, it's more difficult for the patient to explain, because you are using two different insulins. You have to titrate two different insulins separately. So that becomes a very complex regime. And most of the patients will not be able to follow that in a lot of our patients. So this becomes easy, simple, lower hypoglycemia and weight also. So that's more, and gives you the flexibility.
There is no weight gain by this combination, but how much is weight loss?
So, well, there it has been seen 0.7 kg. To my personal experience, I have been using this for a couple of years. It can range from 2 to 4 kgs is the weight loss which I have seen with most of my patients. So from 2 to 4 kgs is the general weight loss. Mind you, this is with an insulin you are using, where with insulin most of the time we see weight gain. Here we are seeing a weight loss with an insulin also.
You can use it with other OHA, SGLT2 inhibitors.
Yes, with the SGLT2 inhibitors as well. Obviously, a GLP-1 or a DPP-4 should not be used. That's standard.
Same mechanism of action.
Yes.
Thank you. Any other question?
Any question from the audience, please? I think there is no question. We could conclude the session. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Dr. Samuel.